We'll talk a couple economic slides and then give you the full picture of where we think food service is going to end up in 2020. We'll talk a little bit about the projection methodology that we're using along with our partner Data Central to come up with the projections that we're going to show you today. And then I'll go through each segment, starting with the restaurants, then I'll go to the on-site segments, and then we'll finish with the retail food service segments like C-stores and grocerants. We'll talk briefly about which segments we think are going to be the ones that are going to recover the quickest, and which ones we think are in it for the long haul in terms of a recovery. And I'll share with you some of our key takeaways that we've talked about. But let's start off by looking at just how the economy was impacted by COVID. Look at those unemployment rates a year ago. So this time last year, we were at 3.5% unemployment. 2020 was gonna be a fantastic year, not only for the economy, but for the food service industry in general. We were really had a positive outlook. Consumer confidence was going really well. And then of course, we know what happened in March. Everyone kind of remembers where they were on March 13th when they went to work for the last time. I remember riding the train home that day. It was a Friday and the train was pretty much empty. There were people with masks on. It was all very surreal. And now, of course, that's become the new normal. Unemployment skyrocketed in April. Layoffs were temporary. Furloughs were happening out there. Some of those layoffs became permanent. The good news is that each month that goes by, the unemployment rate continues to go down. And that's positive, obviously, for the US economy, but it's also, of course, positive for consumer usage of food service once we start feeling comfortable going back to work, and going back to restaurants in general. Like I said, you know, we were going to be looking at a pretty good 2020. Then things went sour for us. Oddly enough, the Bureau of Economic Analysis compares their gross domestic product versus the quarter ago as opposed to the year ago. So you see that Q2 and that Q3 pretty much balancing each other out. Great news, 4.0% growth is the advanced estimate for gross domestic product for the fourth quarter, which compared, look back at 2019, I mean, those are growth rates that are above and beyond. And if you get 4% off of 33.4, that's a sign the economy is doing pretty well. So there are some glimmers of hopes out there, people. We do have to take a look back at 2020. Here's our final projection for 2020. We are expecting 29.8% decline in operator spend in 2020. And then we have it broken out for all the different segments that we're going to be talking about today. Retail food service, which includes convenience stores and the grocery perimeter, two areas that were hit the least. Now down 10.2%. That would have been a horrible, horrible year in any other year except for 2020. But as you can see, compared to the other segments, you know, completely better. At the other end of the spectrum, you're looking at business and industry. Negative 55.1% decline projected for 2020. A lot of that, of course, is on the white collar side of B&I. The blue collar side of B&I actually had a decent, not great, decent 2020 relative to some of the other segments because obviously manufacturing was deemed essential in most states. So I'm not going to go through each one of these. We are going to unpack each segment as we go forward. But as we are looking at our projections, our updated projections for 2021, I do want to point out some of the methodology pieces here. So like I mentioned before, Data Central is our core partner for our forecasts that we publish in IFMA scope. And some of the core resources that they use in order to come up with their projections are listed here. So we just talked about some of the government economic data that I just shared with you. Data Central, as you know, a research company, is continually surveying operators, asking them about their attitudes in terms of growth. What are they expecting? They obviously have their Firefly database, which counts the number of units in the United States, so they can understand the impact of closures on their projections as well. Any type of company, it's the same that's publicly traded and publishes their same-store sales information. That's put into the hopper. What Cisco and US Foods and PFG are reporting in terms of their SEC filings. Those are included. Obviously, in 2020, this is the first time we've ever had to do this, is we're including a vaccine distribution and number of COVID cases into the mix as well. And then one thing that where we really partner up with Data Central is IFMA has their 5 operator councils, K through 12, college, university, B&I, healthcare, and small chains. And what Data Central did is a few weeks ago, they took their forecasts and pressure tested them with the councils. So they met with each of the councils, showed them their forecasts, got some feedback from the councils, and made adjustments based on that feedback. So a real partnership here between Data Central and IFMA to get that done. Here's a couple assumptions that go into the projections as well. We do, the vaccine is going to be available to the entire US population probably by the second half of this year. So vaccination numbers continue to go up. Obviously, not everybody's going to get vaccinated because it is a voluntary thing. So we don't expect there to be any more lockdowns or stay-at-home orders, but we don't expect the business centers in the United States, your Chicago, your San Francisco, or your New York City, all that daytime population, we don't expect that to return until 2022. We also don't expect travel, especially tourist and business travel, to improve much in 2021. A keynote, and make sure you acknowledge this, is as you're looking at these changes and these numbers, they do not include the impact of inflation, which we're projecting at about 4%. So if you do like to include inflation in your numbers, add about 4%, 4 points of inflation into each of the numbers I'm going to share with you. But right now, everything I'm going to share with you does not include inflation. All right, so that's the backbone of things. If you have any questions about these assumptions or the methodology, pop them in the question and answer area, and we'll be answering those during the Q&A section. We have a couple members of the Data Central team that'll be joining us for that Q&A, so we have the right people in place. So our projection for 2021 is relatively unchanged from the projection we made in August of 2020, which was a 7.3% growth in operator spend. We've upped that to 7.5% in 2021. We've also taken our 2020 number for total final 2020 change down from a 28.4 initial projection. We're now at that number I just showed you earlier of a negative 29.8% decline in operator spend. We're also publishing a most likely worst case and best case scenario for 2022. Whenever I show you 2022 numbers today during the webinar, they refer to the most likely projection. So our most likely projection right now, and of course we'll revise these for 2022, is an almost 12% growth in 2022. So you combine the 11.8% and the 7.5%, it still does not get us back to 2019 levels because 2020 was such a terrible year for the food service industry, but at least we're headed in the right direction. But we do anticipate that it's going to take us until 2022, 2023 to really begin to see a full recovery happening because of how difficult, challenging 2020 ended up being. So here are the breakouts among the different segments. On the red lines refer to the 2020 year. The green lines refer to our projections for 2021. And you might say, how can, why is C&U up there as the number one segment in terms of a recovery? What we're going to do is we're going to unpack each of these segments over the next few slides. So the main reason I wanted to include this slide is that when you get a copy of this deck and you wanted all the projections on one page, you now have 2020 and 2021. But in terms of discussing each of the segments, I'm going to wait until we get to the specific slides for each of those before I really take a look at each of those individual segments. So overall, projected operator spend for 2021 is $224.7 billion in operator spend. And that splits out among the three mega segments, which is restaurants, at 133.4, retail food service at 35.9, and the on-site or non-commercial segments like healthcare and college and university making up another 55.4 billion. So any myths out there about the decline of or the disappearance of the food service industry are grossly over exaggerated. We are still a massive industry, and there is still a massive amount of dollars being spent by operators buying product from food service manufacturers. But let's now take apart the restaurant segments and look at our projections and some of the headwinds and tailwinds for each of the segments. And we'll start with a breakout of just how each of the segments is sized, so you have that. Once again, our forecast for 2021 in terms of total restaurant operator spend is 7.4% real growth compared to 2020. In terms of how the 133.4 billion breaks out amongst the segments, QSR continues to be the largest at 60.1 billion, followed by casual dining at 38.5. Midscale and fast casual are almost the same size at just over or under 16 billion. And then finally, the other part of it, which is made up mainly of things like food trucks and ghost kitchens, is included in that other number that you see at 3 billion. So here's the forecast for quick service, and then I'll give you the rest of the segments as well. So overall for 2020, our final number for 2020 on declines is a 20.3% decline in total operator spend for the quick service segment. In 2021, on a real basis, we are projecting a 10.8% growth, and our best guess right now for 2022 is a 12% growth in 2022. Now, among all of the segments in food service, with the exception probably of the grocery perimeter, this was one of the segments that actually took advantage of the way that consumers were nesting in their homes and nesting in their cars, and really took advantage of that by leveraging the service delivery systems they already had in place. So for example, the pizza segment did very, very well in 2020 because they already had delivery ingrained in their system models. QSR restaurants that had drive-throughs did not have to make large adjustments to their service model. They obviously closed down their on-premise dining, but their off-premise dining continued to operate, and they were able to compete and overcome restaurants or other food options that did require a customer or a consumer to go inside of a building. As long as a consumer did not have to go inside a building, they could stay in their car. Those were the occasions that did well in 2020. Now, with all that said, why is the forecast still so negative for quick service? It has a lot to do with those busy business centers. The centers, a lot of those stores were either closed or temporarily closed because there was no business, there was no daytime population in these business centers. We also saw a steep decline in breakfast occasions. More and more people, because they were nesting at home, were using their refrigerators and their toasters and their microwaves to make their breakfast. They weren't on the go. They didn't have anywhere to go in the morning, so there was no need for a breakfast occasion. And then finally, one area that quick service, they asked their consumers to do a lot of the work. Get your own beverage, get your own condiments, bus your own tables. A lot of that, of course, is going to have to change in the future as we look toward it. But those are some of the key drivers behind why we think QSR is going to be one of the fastest recovery segments. The other part of the traditional quick service bubble is fast casual. Declines here of almost 25% in 2020. Our growth projections compared to QSR are much smaller, only 3.8% 2021 growth projections. And then we do expect 2022, however, on a most likely basis, to be significantly better than 21, with a 7.3% growth in operator spend. Now, the key difference, of course, between a fast casual and a traditional QSR is the role of the dining room. A fast casual restaurant, that was part of their value equation for the consumer, was ambiance, music, sit down, wait for your food to come, somebody's going to bring it to your table. And of course, we had to shut all of that down for much of 2020. And a lot of that consumer volume that used to be using fast casual shifted over to either in-home or to using QSRs or deliveries. So fast casual had to really make some changes that were fundamental changes to a lot of their locations, either by really focusing on the carryout aspect or using their technology and their apps and third-party delivery to drive delivery. And so they weren't as able to react as quickly as QSR was to the change in consumer behavior. And we're still seeing them lagging behind and not being able to get up and compete directly with the more traditional fast food like a McDonald's or a Subway or a Pizza Hut or a Taco Bell, for example. So those are the two QSR. Let's move to full service segments now, and we'll take a look at Midscale. Not a good year for Midscale, obviously down almost 34% in terms of operator spend. This was a segment that was struggling before COVID hit, as consumer behavior was really shifting away from wanting to eat the type and having the type of experience that Midscale offered. And so the pandemic, I think, could have a lasting impact on this segment looking forward. And so that's why we're not as robust and bullish in terms of our growth rates for Midscale in both in 2021 and 2022. We do think that they did take advantage of it, and a lot of them found ways to sort of dig into that need for consumers to have comfort food. And Midscale, to a degree, you could say, owns that comfort food space within food service. So providing family meals and being able to, give the entire family a meal that had that comfort food equation to it was part of the value proposition that Midscale brought in 2022. Obviously not enough to compensate for the fact that most of their restaurants were either capacity constrained or completely shut down. And then you add in the fact that breakfast, which is their core day part, is one that is being forsaken by many consumers as they are already at home and have no reason to go out, even on the weekends, which was when Midscale owned that Saturday and Sunday brunch going forward. The other impact on Midscale is heavily independent driven as opposed to the chain driven. And as we're going to sort of discuss throughout today, if you're looking at what part of the restaurant industry is going to have the ability to recover faster, it's obviously going to be the chains. They have the capital and the wherewithal to survive a downturn like the one we're having right now, while the independents, who run on a month-to-month basis or even a week-to-week basis in terms of their cash flow, are going to have a much, much harder time recovering, even with all the PPP loans that came out from the government in early to mid 2020. So we are going to see a steep decline in the number of independents open for business. Casual dining has a lot of the same challenges that Midscale had, in that they do, of course, rely almost exclusively on that dine-in consumer. So we are projecting for 2020 a 35.2% overall decline, 4.7% growth in 21, and 9.1% in growth in 22. What casual dining did do is they accelerated their use of curbside. A lot of them had been talking about it for a long time and were doing it on a smaller scale, maybe only at their company-owned stores, or if they had a more ingenious franchisee who was willing to do curbside, they were willing to take advantage of that. And of course, they were also able to take advantage of the fact that a lot of municipalities lowered the restrictions on carry-out alcohol. And so a lot of them were fulfilling that need for that cocktail on a to-go basis, when before municipalities would have frowned upon that in terms of regulation point of view. So small little pieces that they were able to take care of But really, in the end, it comes down to the fact that consumers are going to continue to be a little bit suspect about eating in, especially if there's not overt signs of real sanitation and cleanliness in those restaurants. And also, just like Midscale, heavily independent based here. So those are the type of restaurants that are going to struggle to recover compared to the large or medium-sized chains that have the capital to move forward. So those are the main restaurant segments. I'm not going to dive into fine dining or food trucks or ghost restaurants, but all that data from those smaller segments is loaded into IFMA scope right now. So all the numbers that I'm showing you are in IFMA scope right now. You don't have to wait to get our updated numbers from that. So now we're going to switch over to OnSite. Just as a reminder, these are the segments that make up the OnSite, oftentimes also referred to as non-commercial segment. So the largest of the bunch is healthcare at 12.3 billion. Second is lodging at K through 12 at 9.4, lodging at 8.8, C&U at just over 6, and then business and industry, or B&I, at 3.5 billion. That big other chunk is made up of things like corrections, vending, recreation, transportation. Instead of breaking it out and showing you all these little tiny slivers, we thought it would be best just to give you a big chunk there that says other. If any of those segments is important to you, like I said, all the new data and all of those segments are reflected in the operator landscape within IFMA scope. So jump over there if you need to get information on any of those smaller on-site segments. Overall, we are expecting the on-site large mega segment to increase in terms of operator spend by 10% in 2021. But let's take a look at each of the segments individually, and we'll start with lodging, which is probably the most hybrid of the two between on-site and restaurants. So if you have on-site restaurant and lodging, or you're doing a catering event, some might call that a restaurant event. But we put lodging and on-site, and you look at that big number, 55.8% COVID impact in 2020. This is one of the segments, along with B&I, that was hit the hardest and is going to have the hardest time coming back in 2021 and 2022. Obviously, business travel pretty much evaporated. Domestic and international tourism pretty much evaporated. Weddings went online. Any type of special events. None of us had been to a conference probably since COEX last March. So there is a need. So there's all that volume that really drove some of that key F&B volume for lodging disappeared entirely. And even if they did have higher occupancy rates, the only meal they were typically serving was breakfast. And usually it was, even if the mid-tier hotel chain is offering breakfast, in 2020 that breakfast was a bag, and it had a yogurt in it and a bottle of water and maybe a thing of cereal. I don't know. So it was really, really slimmed down in terms of what was available from a lodging segment. We do expect pent-up demand to help us bounce back a little bit. We already are seeing some hotels beginning to see occupancy rates start to climb again. RevPAR is coming back. So back in August, when we had our initial projection, we were only projecting a 9.2%. That's that number you see here in parentheses. We have updated that and being a little more optimistic for the lodging segment 21, because the vaccines, I think, are coming out a little faster than we had anticipated back when we made these projections in August of 2020. Healthcare, of course, is made up of hospitals, senior care, and long-term care. 23.2% decline in 2020. And some of you might look at that number and say that seems like a really dramatic decline for a segment that was became sort of the center of essential workers in 2020, because they were the place that were trying to keep and stem the the horrible effects of the COVID pandemic on the population. However, what happened, and the reason that we see such a huge decline in 2020 was visitors were not allowed into hospitals. All elective surgeries did not start coming back until the latter half of 2020. So hospitals became almost only patient feeding, and they were feeding just COVID patients. All their retail operations essentially were shut down or operated on a very, very limited basis, maybe just a micro market here and there. Salad bars disappeared. All those stations that you see typically in a hospital cafeteria, those were shuttered. And lots of them have not reopened, even as visitors are starting to be allowed back into hospitals, even as elective surgeries are starting again. So the healthcare segment definitely being hit hard by the fact that they drive a lot of their revenue from those visitors and from those elective surgeries and elective things like that. So our initial projection back in August was a little more optimistic. We were up at about 4% growth for 2020. We've updated that to just under 3% in 2021, and we do expect 6.5% growth on a most likely basis for 2022. If we split out healthcare among its three sub-segments, we have acute care, also hospitals, senior living, and long-term care. And you can see that the real weight on the whole segment was that acute care portion of it for the reasons I mentioned before, lack of visitors and lack of elective procedures going forward. But we do expect acute care to come back. Senior living had a sort of a resident population that had nowhere to go, and we still had to feed that resident population. So in terms of segments that were almost COVID proof, in terms of losing consumers, senior living was one area that we did not see that steep decline because we had a captured audience that we continued to have to feed. Moving over into the education segments. Let's start with our younger kids in the K through 12 segment, a $9.4 billion segment, down 21.5% in 2020. We are expecting some rather strong growth in 2021. However, it is going to be more slanted toward the 2021-2022 school year. So when we're talking to our K through 12 food service council, a lot of them are saying that they are expecting most of their students in primary and in high schools to be fully back in-person learning for the next school year, which is a great sign for this segment, great sign for our kids and our teachers. And that's why we're pretty bullish with an 8.8% growth for this segment. And we can see that continuing to grow in 2022 with almost 17% growth. So this is a segment we expect to rebound fairly quickly from what happened because feeding kids is such a core part of what they do, and these kids are going to be going back to school. This is one of the most fascinating of the councils in terms of what they talk about, and one of the core messages that this council is talking about is universal meals for kids. A lot of them took advantage of, well, not a lot of them, all of them that are part of the public school system were granted waivers by the USDA. And those waivers allowed them to continue to feed the kids, even though they had no kids actually at the schools. But by law, they have to still feed those kids that are on a free or reduced program. And so what they did is they stopped trying to delineate between who qualifies for a free or reduced and who doesn't qualify it. And they basically said, if you have a student in our public school district, you can come to a location and we'll give you groceries for a week. And so a lot of the school systems used that system in 2020, and some of that might carry on. It's still continuing till now, and it'll probably continue for many school districts that are not reopening and not allowing their students to actually eat in the schools. They're going to be continuing to hand out meals. But like I said, we do expect the 21-22 school year to be much improved over the current school year, which is important for you as manufacturers. Think about your forecasts for 2021-2022 school year. you're going to have to really adjust them from what you saw this year versus what you're going to see in the next school year. So plan ahead for that, and work directly with your school districts to make sure you are meeting what's going to be a real spike in demand if all goes well. If we move to higher education and college and the university segment, once again, another segment that was hit really, really hard by COVID, mainly due to the fact that a lot of students decided to take a gap year. So enrollments were down significantly compared to 2019. And then those students that were on campus, a lot of them were not allowed to leave their housing location to go to the dining halls. The dining halls were either shut down entirely, were carry out only, or were heavily capacity constrained. So that community center that was the college and university dining hall evaporated and went away. The good news is, and the reason that we're giving you that big growth projection number of 15.7% for 21, and then another 30% on top of that for 22, is we're hearing across the board that we're going to see really record enrollment for the next coming school year. All those kids that took a gap year are still able to return and come back to their universities. They don't have to reapply. They were given a waiver to be able to take a gap year and then just start a year later or skip a year. So we do expect, unless we have something terrible happen, that the enrollments are going to be at a record high for college and university, and dining halls should begin to start operating on a relatively normal basis. Stations will reopen and it won't be all to go. So that's why we're pretty bullish on the college and university segment, and our council that we spoke with is on board, and they're also very optimistic about what's going to be like for the next school year. So once again, just like with K through 12, college university is going to be a big change. So make sure you're budgeting and thinking ahead about what your volumes could potentially be as you prepare for the next school year. Don't be caught by surprise if you see a demand that exceeds some of your supply. We're getting near the end of the on-site here, but we are going to tackle another one of those segments along with lodging that's really taken a hit. And it's important here that you think of business and industry not as just your standard office park, but think about all those manufacturing plants and all those essential workers that were continued to work even during the height of the pandemic, because they were deemed to be essential, just like healthcare workers were deemed to be essential. So a lot of that 55.1% decline in 2020 is definitely on the white collar side. And that 15.1% growth is more a reflection of continuing use of manufacturing plants. And then maybe in the fall of this year, we might begin to see populations at office parks begin to return. But a lot of companies right now, I think, are really talking about not bringing back their employees either ever and having them continue to work remotely, or if they are going to bring them back, they're probably not going to bring them back until 2022. So along with mid-scale, casual dining, business and industry is another one that we expect to have a longer term recovery process. And for a lot of business cafeterias that are typically run by food service management companies, they might just shut down indefinitely or permanently, just because there might be not enough employees actually working in their offices going forward. Maybe remote learning is not remote learning, but remote working is the new norm for a lot of companies who are looking to save on costs of running an office, costs of renting, costs of all the maintenance that they have to do. And until public transportation is deemed and felt to be safe by all consumers who work and depend on public transportation, we expect business industry also to continue to struggle. The final piece of the big three, restaurants, on-site, and now retail food service, which is broken into convenience stores and grocerants, and then some other smaller ones that we're not going to go into today. But only it's hard to say, only down 10.2% in 2020, and we've revised our forecast for 2021. We were only projecting about a 3.3% growth in 21. Based on the data that we're getting now, we feel confident in a 4.5% growth rate for 21 and another 6.1% in 22 for a $35.9 billion segment, which is retail food service. Hit hard once again by the fact that there was a lot less people on the road, a lot less commuters, and breakfast, which is such a core part of the C-store experience. Breakfast sandwiches, coffee, drinks to go, the whole self-serve idea hit this segment hard. The good news is for a lot of these places is that they were not at all capacity constrained. They don't have any, they don't rely at all on sit down unless you're going down into some of the southern states where C-stores are a blend of a restaurant and a C-store, but we still remain pretty bullish on the retail food service segment, especially in both the grocerant side and the C-store side. So this is the only chart in the entire presentation where you look at a number for 2020 and it's actually positive. So 2.4% growth, yep, that's one word we haven't used much for 2020, 2.4% growth for grocerant. So that's the grocery perimeter, prepared foods, managed and eaten for almost immediate consumption, no preparation involved. That's how we define grocerants, up 2.4% in 2020, continued growth in 21 and 22. C-store is going to rebound from that almost 17% decline with a 5.9 in 21 and a 10% estimated growth in 2022. In terms of the long-term outlook, here is what we think in terms of who's going to recover the quickest versus who's going to struggle the most going forward. So on the near term, it's the ones that we talked about. Healthcare, we expect to return fairly normal. K through 12, we talked about, and college university with school year coming up being a good school year. QSR largely was already prepared for something like this, even though they didn't even know that they were going to have to be prepared for something like this. And then we just talked about retail food service. Fast casual and casual dining, a midterm recovery. And then the ones that we really do expect to have the hardest time coming back, we could be looking at a 3, 4, or even 5-year recovery to get back to the volumes we saw in 19. That's the mid-scale restaurants, white collar part of B&I, the recreation segment, obviously that's where sports stadiums come in, bowling alleys, movie theaters, and then lodging as well. So we hope we're wrong on the long-term recovery, but we do need to be realistic about what we're looking at. So like I said, the update has happened in IFMA scope. So if you go now to the operator landscape portion, the numbers that I've just showed you have been updated there. You can find IFMA scope at ifmaworld.com, and all the numbers that you're going to want to get in terms of 21, 22, if you want the most likely, the worst case, the best case for 2022, all of that information has been updated. The unit counts are up to date, including all the closures we had in 2020. So make sure that if you haven't downloaded the most recent numbers out of operator landscape, that you go there today or tomorrow, download them, hit the Excel button, and all that data automatically transports right over into Excel for you. All right, so that's about 40 minutes of Charlie talking. Before I go into some of the key takeaways, I do want to see if we have some questions that have come through. And let me see what we've got here in terms of questions. Give me a moment to manipulate my pieces here, and I do. And I want to bring in, for this part of the section, I want to bring in Brian Darr and Ann Galladay, both from Data Central. They and their team were the key architects of these most recent forecasts that we've done. And Brian, are you with us?
Yes, thanks, Charlie, for having us be part of this.
So I just gave my perspective, Brian, on a lot of the, the segments and why we're, forecasting the numbers we're forecasting. Did I miss anything? Do you have any additional color that you want to add to any of the segments before we tackle some of these questions?
Sure, I'd glad to add a little bit more. You didn't miss anything, but I did want to add a little bit more color because I think one of the things that we get a lot of questions about is the speed and robustness of the recovery as a vaccine rollout. And there's a number of factors that play into that. And you mentioned consumer confidence and pent-up demand. And while those are certainly part of it, we certainly see 4 other areas that that contribute to that. And I did want to shed a little light on that. The 4 areas are restaurant openings and closures, unemployment specific to the hospitality industry, what consumers are feeling and thinking and their attitudes about restaurants, as well as the supply chain. So all of these have to be working in sync really for recovery to be robust. So when we look at openings and closings, our Firefly service scans over 600, the open close status of over 650,000 restaurants every single week. And when we look at the 12-month period from mid-March 2020 through mid-February 2021, we're looking at close to 93,000 restaurant closures. For that same period, mid-March 2020 to mid-February 2021, there was less than 15,000 openings. So that's a difference of literally 78,000 closed restaurants net. So to have a robust recovery, you need to have restaurants open and you need to have workers working them. And in that same time period, the hospitality industry shed about 2.5 million jobs, which is around 15% of the pre-pandemic hospitality employment. So that's tough. That's going to be slow to rebound because restaurants have to reopen and those workers have to come back, and so it's going to take time to absorb that. The third thing that we didn't spend a lot of time on, but certainly factor into this, is the supply chain. It's still a bit of a mess. It was slow to wind down. We all heard the stories about food going to waste because of the significant drop off in restaurant purchases. It's also going to be slow to ramp up. And so operators are going to still focus on smaller menus, reduced number of items offered, and they're going to count heavily on versatile products, as well as those products that they're pretty sure that they can get regularly. So that's going to factor into that. And then the last thing, which you touched on a little bit, Charlie, is for certainly for the remainder of 2021, and we think it'll continue into 2022. Consumers are going to be hyper focused on restaurant and food service cleanliness, and we do believe that that's going to factor in for quite a while. And so restaurants, supermarkets, and C-stores really need to address any concerns around their operation cleanliness and that image that's conveyed to the consumer. They have to address that head on to factor into the recovery as well.
Great points, Brian. Thanks for bringing that forward and clarifying some of that. Those are some staggering numbers that you're mentioning there. And so I want to shift over now to our audience, which is, of course, as usual, super active, asking a lot of great questions. And looks like one of the questions here is around the baseline for 2020. So either you, Brian, or you, Ann, if you could, when we talk about the 2020 COVID impact, does that mean, is that a 2020 versus 19 comparison, or is that a 2020 actual versus 2020 what it was before COVID?
Yeah, it's the second one of those, Charlie. So it's what we thought 2020 was going to be. If COVID hadn't happened, what 2020 would have been, and then it is what 2020 actually ended up at. Yep.
So if you are, just keep that in mind as you are sharing these numbers within your organizations. We expected 2020 to be a decent year in terms of comparison to 2019. Obviously, it was not a decent year. It was the complete opposite of that. But you can use the 2020 numbers as a surrogate for your growth rates over 2019. Just have that little bit of an asterisk next to those numbers. Another methodology question here: is office coffee services included in the B&I segment, or is that part of vending?
Good question. It's I think we actually usually have that as part of vending.
Correct.
I'd have to double check that, right? Yeah, isn't that right, Brian? Yeah. So.
Yes, correct. It's part of vending.
And then in IFMA scope, we break out food, beverage, NA beverage, and packaging or non-foods. Has that distribution been updated, or is that still at the pre-COVID numbers in terms of that distribution?
So they're not pre-COVID. So we updated those, Charlie, in August. So they're kind of middle COVID. I think since then it's gotten even more extreme. But unfortunately, we didn't have fielding for data in this sort of 6-month break just now. So in the summer, I'm sure when we update these numbers again, we're probably going to see even more of a shift towards that disposable purchasing, and the mix of what operators are buying is absolutely changing.
Okay, so another key point, those of you who are in the packaging world and you're looking at your numbers and saying, we had a decent year in 2020 based on what happened, the numbers in IFMA scope are not going to fully reflect everything that happened in terms of the increase of use of packaging. We are going to update those numbers in August of this year, so you'll have a better concept of what that distribution is between food, beverage, and packaging going forward. Let's see, I'm moving down my list here. Yes, we are updating IFMA scope today, so if you go into IFMA scope right now, you will be looking at the most current numbers. Do you think Midscale Independents will outperform or underperform versus their chain competition? I'll give my thoughts, and then Brian, if you want to jump in and offer color on top. I think the chains are going to outperform the independents. Unfortunately, only because I got a soft spot for independents in my heart, a lot of the independents unfortunately are not going to be able to reopen. I think while the chains, like I said, probably have the saved up cash flow that they can use to work through the recovery and then reopen themselves when times are better. Do you have a differing opinion, Brian, or are you on the same page?
I don't. I agree. However, I will note that we track this within Firefly, and Midscale Independents, which tend to be family-owned operations a lot of times, did fare better than we would expect during the pandemic. And it's and we think there's a few factors there. Those family-run operations really kind of dug in and worked the extra hours as they had to cut back some of their staff, and they were pretty quick to pivot to takeout. Not so much delivery, but really do a better job or a very good job of pivoting to takeout and carry out. And as that morning day part started to shrink for them, they did well with comfort food and takeout, family meals, those types of kind of programs and offerings. So it was actually pretty impressive the way that they handled themselves. but you're right. It's tough because the chains do have that extra purchasing clout, and it's just you're right. They're probably gonna in the end fare better than independents.
Great. I got a couple questions that probably you can answer better than I can because they relate a little bit to Firefly. Are you able to look and see if closed restaurants are being replaced by new restaurants? Do you guys have a sense of that, or is it more just a subjective thought?
We can actually track that to a certain extent, as long as because we check it by address, and the short answer is yes. They are being replaced by new restaurants. There was also those restaurants that were scheduled to open during 2020, and some of those were able to open. Their backers were able to open those up. But the net, as I noted, there is a lot of empty restaurants, close to north of 75,000 restaurants right now, and we certainly think that there's going to be a change in the commercial real estate marketplace as far as changes in rents. And then those restaurants that did stay open and got rent deferrals are at some point going to have to deal with that. So we actually think that our restaurant closure number is going to tick up through 2021.
Just building on that, you mentioned the number 78,000 net restaurant closures. Do you have a top of your head, either you or Ann, a percentage of total? So what percentage?
Yeah, that's yeah. So the total number of closures right now for that 12-month period is just under 93,000, and the total number of openings is just under 15,000. So when you look at that 92,400 closures, that's about 12%.
Wow.
So when you look at the net closures at around 78,000, we're looking at just over 10% closure rate. Our baseline is right around 765,000 restaurants in the.
Does that include temporary closures and permanent, or just permanent?
It is temporary and permanent. Because closed is closed right now, and that's the way that we're looking at it. We do track them separately in Firefly.
Relatively bullish on prepared foods and restaurants, even though probably all of them shut down their salad bars and any self-serve locations, hot bar, whatever it might have been. Why is Data Central relatively bullish on that segment, even in 2020?
Well, I'll start, and then Ann, if you want to chime in. A couple of things. It was a difference in there's fewer traffic going into the prepared area, but we're seeing that the prepared foods areas, they were able to pivot to more pre-packaged. They moved away from soup bars and salad bars and things like that, and they pivoted more to packaged sandwiches, meals, family meals to go, and so there was more of that purchasing. So it actually ended ticking up with regard to that. And there was that shift, and that comfort food factor played in here as well, Charlie, in that, people were buying, meals or a couple, 2 or 3 days worth of meals. We saw that spending per trip went up, the number of trips went down. So people were stocking up when they went. So they would buy 2 or 3 days worth of meals, both from the perimeter as well as up and down the aisle, because we saw things like frozen food go up, you know, canned items, soup, things like that. So there was a increase in purchases in the perimeter as well as on the aisle.
And Ann, I'm not going to let you build on that because I'm going to ask you a different question about a different segment, and that's ghost kitchens. We didn't address that in the presentation, but is Data Central factoring in ghost kitchens as part of their growth projections? Are you guys thinking that we're going to continue to see more growth in that area?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the landscape, we basically just sort of asterisk it as, you know, it's going to be off the charts. You know, tracking them is obviously pretty complicated. You know, Brian can sort of talk to the specifics of Firefly a bit more, but, you know, is an existing operator that opens another banner at their location, you know, is that new? Is that not new? You know, a lot of how we think of it is that, you know, that's sort of the same location. It's just a branding question or menu question. And so, you know, it's a real challenge, something we're sort of working on and trying to improve tracking them, because there's certainly an area of growth that we're certain of.
Great.
Yeah, and within Firefly, we're planning to release that as a segment, and we'll be tracking it as true ghost kitchens that are delivery only versus what we call like a kitchen center, which can be more like a commissary that also has that delivery or takeout aspect. And we're going to be tracking virtual brands as well, since we're seeing that both on an independent basis being offered through, you know, Grubhub partnerships or US Foods partnerships, for example, and other things, as well as restaurant chains launching their own delivery only virtual brands. So that's to come in Firefly within the next couple months.
Ann and Brian, thanks so much for stepping in and helping me get through some of these questions. Your expertise is invaluable. Thanks for putting together these updated numbers. To our audience, thanks for all the questions. I'm not going to walk you through the key takeaways. Easy reading here for you. We are going to make this whole recording posted at ifmaworld.com tomorrow. The slides that I just presented posted at ifmaworld.com tomorrow. And all you have to do in return is register your company for COEX, April 12th, 13th, and 14th. We have corporate registrations available. So register your company and then send the entire employee population virtually to COEX next in April. We have an amazing agenda put together for you, including our speed meetings with our operators. Go to ifmaworld.com, go to the event, check out the agenda, and then register yourself or take advantage of the amazing savings involved in our corporate registration. I hope you guys